Even though Genesis is the first book found in our Bible, you may know, it was not the first book written or recorded. Scholars believe it was probably written about the 6th century BC, while the Israelites were captives in Babylon. If you remember, the country had been destroyed. All the leaders and skilled and intelligent people had been deported to Babylon, and they are slaves in a totally pagan culture. And you remember that the Israelites believed in only one God, Yahweh, who they believed to be God of all creation. But they were surrounded by people who had many gods and many different religions. So how could they hang on to their faith under such circumstances? It could seem like their God had let them down, because here they were captives, subject to the mighty Babylonians. Everywhere they looked, there were temples, there were statues, there were rituals celebrating all these other gods, everywhere. Like all people, there were also creation stories. Where do we come from? How do things happen? Concerning the origin of the world and of human beings. There was a Gilgamesh epic, Enuma Elish, and Atrahasis story, for examples. In the Near East, people explored their cultural beginnings through stories, not through science or abstract thinking like we tend to do now in our technological and scientific world. And Genesis was the unique story of those Israelites. It expressed a very different understanding of and relation to God than any of others of those Mesopotamian creation stories of that time. Then it was countercultural, just as it truly is countercultural now in our scientific technological age. And just for an example, I'll tell you the story of Atrahasis that was popular in Babylon about the time that they were captives there. It begins in the heavens with a rebellion of the lower class gods against the higher class gods. And it's resolved by creating human beings to do all that dirty work, all that maintenance work that the rebels refused to do. And eventually the human race offends those gods by its explosive spread throughout the world. And the gods can't stand all that noise that they make. So they plan a succession of plagues to get rid of them, culminating in that great flood that wipes out everyone except for one, Utnapishtim. The gods finally put an end to that human disturbance. And from that one surviving man, a fresh beginning is made, with safeguards built in against that population growth that led to the disaster. That's one creation story, very different from ours. And the Gilgamesh epic is even bloodier and much more gorier than this one. All the pagan creation stories featured war and murder between rival gods who are capricious. They have no genuine concern for humankind or for the world, but simply their own self-interest and power. So if we compare that with this account in Genesis, they start with the very beginning of the cosmos when only God and chaos existed. One God, not many gods fighting between each other. One God who speaks and it happens. One who works and then blesses and affirms the creation. Genesis is not meant to be a detailed scientific explanation of how it happened, but is telling what God intended. That God was not capricious, but worked in an orderly manner with a plan. And humankind was not created to do God's dirty work, but to be partners and agents, created in the image of this gracious, creative God. And notice the account said that God created humankind, not individuals separate from each other. The Hebrew God is about relationship between and among humans and between humans and God. Walter Brueggemann, who is one of the greatest Old Testament scholars, said creation is God's decision not to look after himself, but to focus his energies and purposes on the creation. The news is that God and God's creation are bound in a relationship that's assured, but at the same time is delicate and precarious. The relationship is grounded in a mystery of faithful commitment. Everything depends on that commitment. It's not one of coercion, but a free, gracious commitment and invitation to full trust. Creation faith, he says, is the church's confession that all life is characterized by graciousness, and that the creation is a source of rejoicing and delight for both the Creator, who says it's very good, and for the created. This is a very different idea about the meaning and purpose of creation than any of the other stories I've ever heard, and was told to refute the claims of all those other religions. And it really was an amazing claim. Even though they're in exile, probably with some despair and hopelessness, yet they will cling to their God and believe that goodness and yes is stronger and more eternal than violence and no. They will believe that God is not careless or casual or accident-prone in designing and creating the cosmos. And God is powerful. We just sang, this is my Father's world. Able to create simply by speaking the word, and all the forces of nature will obey. And the creatures are invited to listen and to respond by being good shepherds of the creation. Invited, not impelled. A little different than their experience with the Babylonians. All of life and relationship in this creation story is characterized by graciousness and delight to God and among humankind. Perhaps the most astonishing and significant feature of the Hebrew creation story is the concept of Sabbath. That was unique among all the religions or political views. Sabbath means a day of rest, just as God did after 6 days of work. Brueggemann says, in the exilic period, the observance of the Sabbath had a special significance for the exiled Israelites. It was an act which announced their faith in God and a rejection of all those other gods, all those other religions, all those other worldviews. The celebration of a day of rest was then the announcement of trust in this God, who God himself was confident enough to rest. He says it was then and now is an assertion that life does not depend on our feverish activity or self-securing, but that there can be a pause in which life is given to us simply as a gift. God did not spend his seventh day in exhaustion, but in serenity and peace. And in contrast to the gods of Babylon, this God is not anxious about his creation, but at ease with the well-being of his rule. Sabbath assumes that the world is safely in God's hands and will not disintegrate if we stop our efforts for 1 day a week. The world relies on God's promises, not simply on our efforts. True Sabbath, Brueggemann says, is the end of human grasping and therefore the end of exploitation. A very revolutionary equality in society, because on that day of Sabbath, everybody rests equally, regardless of wealth, regardless of power, regardless of need. True Sabbath, of course, then and now. We don't have true Sabbath yet. But keeping the Sabbath in heaven and on earth is a foretaste and anticipation of how creation will be when God's will is fully established. Sabbath is an unspoken prayer for the coming of a new sanity, shaped by the power and the graciousness of this amazing triune God. Today, we too can look around at our world and become despairing, confused, or hopeless as we see pictures of all the wars that humanity fights, all the violence, the destruction of those little children, the killing and maiming of humans and large portions of God's creation. And we can question the graciousness of humanity. And we can be assured that God does not delight in the violence or destruction of his creation. But we can hear also a strong word of hope in this Genesis account. Simply by speaking, God transformed reality from chaos into an orderly and good cosmos. Created in God's image, we too are invited to speak blessing and affirmation, and thereby help to make it a reality in our world. I'm sure that we can all think of times in our life when we've spoken a word that caused conflict, but we can also speak words of healing and hope, comfort, forgiveness, and love. We can believe in a God of mercy and grace for all, and share the good news even with our enemies. And we can hear this creation story as a story about faith in God, not as some silly myth or a debatable scientific explanation. Just as the captives long ago in Babylon didn't need scientific explanations to help them deal with their desperate situation, we too can find hope and help and peace and hopefully great delight in believing that God cares intimately about all of his creation and about each of us. By taking Sabbath seriously, we can regularly take time to worship this wondrous triune God and also express our trust that God truly is in charge of all creation for all eternity. The whole rest of the Bible recounts time after time that God has provided ways, God has provided leaders to redeem and to continually recreate his precious cosmos. And we believe that God is still creating, still chooses us to be his agents and partners in that creation. And I hope that we can find delight in that responsibility as we graciously listen to God's words to us and seek to do his will, trusting that all we need will be provided now and evermore. Amen. Let us join in singing Morning is Broken.